Hello and welcome back to the Georgia Electron Microscopy. We're going to be talking about post-staining, which is a technique that we use to put more heavy metal onto our sections on the TEM grids. We finished sectioning and we have sections on the grids, but now we need more contrast for the TEM. To do that, we usually use two chemicals that are common, uranyl acetate and lead citrate. For this, you're going to need a petri dish. I typically use a large glass petri dish like this. This one already has some sodium hydroxide, and I'll talk about why that's there in a little bit. The other thing you'll need that I find helpful is having parafilm. So if you just remove the film from the outside, this side will be clean, so I'll lay that upside so that the grids will be laying on that, and then I tack it down to make sure it's not going to go anywhere. The next thing you're going to need, of course, are the stains. We have uranyl acetate, which has been wrapped in foil to keep it light tight. It's been said that the uranyl acetate will precipitate out in exposure to light for a long period of time. This is at 4% aqueous solution. Some people use it in methanol or ethanol. And this is lead citrate. I typically put a drop, so we have them in syringes with a syringe filter, because if there are any precipitants, then hopefully the syringe will keep them from being transferred. Then I also put a drop of the lead citrate in here, since we already have our sodium hydroxide, to try to avoid precipitation of the lead. And then I also add water. So not to the stain themselves, but a drop next to them, so that as I'm transferring it, the time is up. I put it right into the water to begin washing. If I have a lot of grids, this becomes very helpful to stop it when you would like to stop it. Once again, I have a filter on the tip, mostly for bacteria or fungi that might grow in the water. So the next thing we need is our grids. Now, many of you are familiar with the tweezers that we use in electron microscopy. It's very common for us to use a Dumont or Inox or other version of these jeweler's tweezers. They're very fine point, and you can find them at any electron microscopy store like Electron Microscopy Sciences or Ted Pella or SPI, for example. Not a sponsor. And then you'll grab the grids that you need to post-stain. I do this, I put them on the dull side because I can see the sections then and know that they're there. I tend to not be able to see them when they're on the shiny side. There are proponents for either side, and they have their various arguments, but I've always told my students, pick a side and stick with it. You want the sections to be in contact with the stain, so that's why you need to know where they are. And then you just float them right onto the water, onto the stain. Once you have it floating on the surface, we're going to cover it. I have a lid that's foil lined once again to eliminate the light. We're going to cover that up and let it go for a half an hour. After our time is up, we're going to carefully take out our take off our grid, and we need to be able to wick off the excess uranyl acetate. So we use a wedge of filter paper. This is a Wattman #1 that I've folded and then torn. And then you're just going to move up your forceps to the grid and wick off that excess. I do this because if there's any contaminants in your forceps at all, you'll be drawing them away from your grid as you pull the excess liquid off. And then transfer it over to water until you're ready to rinse it. Now remember, you don't want it to dry out during that period or you'll get precipitants, and so you want to move fairly quickly. And now there's two ways to wash. One way that I prefer, and I'll explain a little bit, is to just to dunk these continuously in beakers of clean distilled water. I usually go 30 to 50 times, just because you want to make sure you really rinse off the stain well, because if you don't, and any stain is left, it will precipitate. Uranyl acetate leaves these crystals The other method is to have a beaker of some kind to collect water, and then you take a squirt bottle and you will just squirt it over the forceps themselves, allowing the water to drain over the grid. Once again, the length of time is empirical, but you just want to make sure you rinse it very, very well so that you don't have any stain left on your grid. Once again, I usually do the forceps first to make sure I'm pulling the liquid away from the grid, because if you touch it tip first, there's a chance that if anything's in here, it's going to get drawn across the grid. Once it's dry, you can either put it back in its grid box or on a filter paper, or you can just go ahead and move it directly into the next stain, the lead citrate. Once again, you're going to float section side down so that the sections are in contact with the liquid. And in this case, we have our sodium hydroxide pellets around the outside. The sodium hydroxide is a scavenger for CO2. So the problem with lead citrate is if it comes in contact with CO2, it will precipitate out. So if you're breathing heavy on it because you're just so excited about getting to see your sample, or if your area just has a lot of CO2 in the water, it's just a way of scavenging that CO2. It's the same with washing. The problem with water is that it does absorb CO2 over time, especially cold water has a higher ability to hold CO2. So a lot of people will boil the water freshly before using it and then allow it to cool down. That drives off the CO2. The other method is to have that first drop over here, instead of being water, it is a dilute solution of sodium hydroxide, and that would be your first wash. Now the timing is 30 minutes, typically, as I mentioned before, for uranyl acetate, depending on your sample, and then usually a much shorter time for the lead citrate. Typically we do 5 minutes. The reason it's much shorter is it doesn't take that long to stain, but also it's a very alkaline solution, and so it will destain over time what you've done with your uranyl acetate. And then once again, you would pick it up, move it over to your drop of dilute sodium hydroxide or boiled water, and let it sit while you pull over other grids if you have many other grids. And then once again, you would wash it. All right, once again, wicking them off. And then putting them in their grid box until you're ready, until they're dry and you're ready to look at them. Be sure to contact us through our email, gem@uga.edu, if you have any questions or I didn't cover something clearly enough. We're always here to help you to get your work done.